Hi everybody, and welcome to the Multicultural Programs presentation put together by Ariana Garcia, Ben Hurt, Claudia Hernandez, Madeline Lopez, and Jonathan Stubblefield. We hope you enjoy this presentation that outlines the roots and history, the present status, and the future direction of multicultural programs as a functional area of student affairs in higher education. First, we'll take a look at the roots and history of multicultural programs on campuses in the United States. To really understand this, we have to take a look at what we've been studying in this class the first few weeks and just the history of higher education in America. Institutions were set up for individuals with privileged identities and excluded those with underrepresented identities. We saw these institutions were primarily for white male and they were established to further membership of the clergy for students to study religious subject matter. Until the Civil War, really, and then the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. After that, it made it possible for individuals to have separate but equal access to education. And although this was quote-unquote equal, it was separate. And the underrepresented populations had access to historically black colleges, tribal colleges, women's colleges, etc. And then as we move forward about a half a century, right, where the civil rights movement began to gain traction, and another pivotal Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, this desegregated the educational system and allowed underrepresented students to enroll at what we now know as predominantly white institutions. And this was a huge tipping point in the idea that multicultural programming and multicultural centers were necessary on college campuses, because before this time it wasn't really necessary. It wasn't recognized as a necessity. After the civil rights movement, students from underrepresented backgrounds really began to enroll at these traditionally white and predominantly white institutions. Also in this era was the passing of federal legislation creating programs like the TRIO program that were built to support these underrepresented students in their path through higher education. Bringing us quickly to the present, the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education have set standards of excellence for multicultural programs. This is one of the functional areas that they specify. We see here assessing the needs of minority students, providing support services for those students, promoting the development of students, and promoting and deepening student understanding of cultures and heritages. Offering and identifying mentors and role models, and providing education efforts for majority and minority students. Now, it's important for us to note that these are the CAS standards for multicultural programs, and that doesn't necessarily mean that every institution meets these standards. These are just standards that have been set as ideal and best practices for institutions, and we thought that this is a critical thing to present to the class and have a good understanding of what this function area in student affairs really looks like. Many institutions have expanded their service to reach individual identities rather than group them under one umbrella. And so there's kind of two models that are happening in the United States. One where their services to reach individual identities, for example, a Black Student Service office or a Native American office over here. Or there's another model where institutions have a multicultural center where all students are welcome and all doors are open. Services such as these are being supported by institutions who wish to increase the number of underrepresented students on their campus. And this is big, and this is where programs like the TRIO program or some bridge programs to get students to come to college really aid in students coming and transitioning to college campuses. For example, at the University of Wyoming, where I work, we just hosted a Native American Summer Institute where we had high school students come to campus, have 3 weeks of fun classes, and then they go home. And so it's a hope to get them introduced to the University of Wyoming in hopes that they will then come here when they finish their high school years. There's also the issue of changing demographics on college campuses in the United States. In addition to domestic, racial, and ethnic minorities that we've seen since the Civil Rights Movement, there's an increased need for programs for LGBTQ students. There's a huge increase in international student populations on our campuses, and the idea of needing support for students with religious diversity. And as a group, we talked about this, and it all leads to the idea of intersectionality and the importance that we all hold multiple identities, and some are more salient in our identity than others. But at any given time, we all have multiple identities. And so universities need to meet students where they are, regardless of how they identify. And that really is a good segue into the future direction of multicultural affairs and the idea of multi-ethnic and more intersectional multicultural centers. Some universities are offering more inclusive centers, as I mentioned before, that don't break up students into individual categories and trying to be more inclusive to biracial and multi-ethnic students. Right now, the majority of universities have centers for individual ethnic groups. However, as the student population is evolving, it'll be really important for colleges and universities to change their models and evolve with the evolving student population. There's also the great need for centers designed to meet the needs of Middle Eastern students. And again, this is an intersection of both race, ethnicity, and religion coming together to meet student needs and make students feel comfortable on campus. There's also a little bit of uncertainty in this functional area with regard to federally funded programs. As we talked about in the history, really the birth of these multicultural programs on college campuses was due to federal funding that was passed in the 1960s and 1970s to support underrepresented populations going to college. Programs like TRIO, like Student Support Services, and like the McNair Scholars Program. Many of these federally funded programs that are built to assist multicultural groups are in jeopardy. These programs are constantly at risk for funding cuts, specifically with the current federal administration. The recent economic budget presented by the current administration calls for a $124 million cut from the TRIO program and a complete elimination of the McNair Scholars Program. And so the funding for this functional area on a federal level is certainly in jeopardy. There are numerous professional associations for this functional area. The one of note is the Multicultural Institute. It's not necessarily a professional association, but it's an institute put on by the NASPA Association. It's a biennial conference for professionals that work in this functional area. There's also ethnic-specific and race-specific associations, the Association for Black Culture Centers. There's associations for Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges and things of that nature. Here we put an image on the screen of the NASPA Multicultural Institute for this year. It happens in December, and they've got a timeline of registration. But the folks that I've talked to that have attended it in the past say that it's a great event. One of the individuals interviewed for this project was Conrad Chavez. He's the Multicultural Affairs Manager at the University of Wyoming. And catching up with Conrad, he's worked in the center at the University of Wyoming for nearly 10 years. And in his tenure, the University of Wyoming has shifted from, just like we discussed in this presentation, from a model of offices specific to an individual ethnicity and an individual race to a more overarching office of multicultural affairs. And in his words, the goal of making this shift was to break down the silos in between areas and have students interact with each other and interact in a more inclusive manner. He thinks that it was a pretty good idea. He did say, though, unfortunately, it has caused less professional staff positions on our campus devoted to multicultural work. In breaking down those silos, they also lost staff and haven't filled some of those positions. Most recently, Conrad was instrumental in hiring the university's first chief diversity officer, who's scheduled to begin work this August. I talked with Conrad about kind of what, if money wasn't an issue, what would multicultural affairs look like on our campus? And his comment was to have a space for the multicultural office where there could be a large common area in the middle with more specific offices and meeting rooms around the outside. He thought if there's an inviting common space where students can feel welcome, that a lot of these things can happen organically, just with students interacting with one another and meeting one another. That was one of his goals. And so here are some of the references that we used in our research, and so we hope that you enjoy looking at those, and we hope that you enjoy looking at the handout. There's a lot of great information on our handout as well, and we look forward to interacting with all of our classmates in the discussion threads. We've got 3 discussion questions for everyone, so we're excited to discuss everything with you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the threads.